Welcome back to Society. This is our final U.S. presidential projection for the contest between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. This is who we believe will win based on the model we're using. And that model is all of the votes that have been counted thus far as early votes in the various battleground states using the NBC News Decision 2024 website, as well as past data through exit polling using CNN Politics website, America's Choice 2020. We've gone through each of the states and identified party ID in 2020. For example, in the state of Texas, among independents, 51% voted for Biden, 45% voted for Trump. Among Republicans, 94% voted for Trump, and 5% of Republicans switched parties over to Biden. Democrats, 96% voted for Biden, and 4% switched parties to go over to Trump. So we are presuming that all Democrat votes will go over to Harris, and all GOP will go over to Trump, and then superimposing the behavior of how independent votes will behave or did behave in 2020 and superimposing that onto 2024, also the party switch to the various different candidates that we talked about. In this case, obviously, Harris replacing Biden. Now, I then took all of that data and created a spreadsheet. You can see here the top line refers to the number of votes cast by the various parties in the battleground states that include Texas, Florida, Iowa, Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And you can see that this first line represents the number or percentage of folks who were registered eligible to vote in that particular state and then did actually vote. In this case, in 2020, in the state of Texas, of all eligible voters in that state, 60.4% showed up to vote, either by in-mail, absentee, in-person early, or in-person on election day, and so forth and so on for the various states. All the way over to the right of this first section, up here, you can see the number of actual votes that were cast in that given state. And then in the middle portion in the blue are the number of votes cast for Democrats, the number of votes cast for GOP, and the number cast for independents. You can also see that to the right of that first column, for example for Dems, is the percentage of registered Democrats that actually showed up to vote in Texas. 63% showed up to vote. Among GOP, 75% showed up to vote, thus making a difference of 1.2 million in favor of GOP. But because independents did tend to lean more toward Democrats than they did toward GOP in the state of Texas, that's where we saw that it narrowed down the lead Trump had over Biden in 2020 to, I think, roughly 3.5% to 4%. All right, so once we've taken that data, we then move on to this next section where in the pink here are the number of early votes that were cast in the given state. Off to the right is the percentage total of the 2020 that showed up to vote. For example, in the state of Texas, 81% of the total number of votes that showed up to vote in 2020 already cast their vote early in 2024. So that is a record early show. And also a record in Florida, in Georgia, and in North Carolina. Some of the other states, for example in Iowa, only 30% showed up to vote early. And in the state of Pennsylvania, you can see only 28% showed up to vote early. In some of these states, you're depending on the particular state's policies, you may or may not be able to show up early to vote, or you may not be able to do an absentee or mail-in ballot. Every state is different. But when it's all said and done, in the battleground states, 36.8 million have showed up to vote. And that's 66% of all that showed up to vote in 2020, where there were 55.7 million. So really only a difference of 19 million. So most likely in the battleground states, we will surpass in 2024 the number of folks coming out to vote in the election compared to 2020. Now in this last section, or this middle section here rather, the third section, I then put the states in and the percentage that showed up to vote already early. For example, 78% of Democrats have showed up to vote in the state of Texas early, and 83% of GOP, 85% of independents. So that is already very, very high, breaking records. But you can see obviously more GOP showed up to vote than Democrats. And then that is the case for each state, and then we create a multiplier out of 100%. We subtract the early vote, and then we use that number as the projected same-day vote. For example, in Texas, 78% of Democrats have showed up already early to vote. So out 70.78 minus 1, or rather 1 minus 0.78 is 0.22. So we take that 22.22 multiplied by the number of votes cast already, and we're expecting around 960,000 to show up on the same day. We then add that to the number that already showed up early, and we get a total projected vote for the state of Texas among Democrats. We do the same for GOP, and then finally the same for independents. Now, once we've done that, we go to our last section, and that's when we superimpose the behavior of independents and the switchover between parties. And we multiply all that in, and we get a total expected or projected vote. And then that gives us a percentage of only the votes cast for either Harris or Trump that totals 100%, and what percent they'll be receiving of that 100% between only Trump and Harris. You can see, for example, 51% plus 45% makes up 96%. So 4% voted for someone else in 2020. And we are superimposing that again in the state of Texas. We're expecting roughly about that percentage to vote for someone other than Harris or Trump. And we're going to continue doing the crossovers between candidates as it happened in 2020. And lastly, I just want to point out all the way over here to the right, you can see that we're expecting about 15% more to show up to vote in the 2024 election compared to 2020. So it will be a record-breaking year. And then also there are 32 million mail-in ballots that have yet to be counted, and that will be trickling in over the course of the next few days. So if you are a Democrat, typically that will favor you by about 60% or 55 to 60% compared to roughly 40 to 45% for GOP. That tends to be less likely to mail in their vote. So that is what happened in 2020 when it looked like some of the blue wall states or the battleground states in the Midwest were going to go to Trump. But as the day went on and the evening got later, going on to the next morning, when you woke up, you saw some of those states turn blue. That's because the mail-in ballots are among the last things to be counted. Also, we want to also see that polling suggests about 60% of Democrats will vote early, whereas only about 50% of GOP will vote early. So that means about 50% will come out on election day, and about 40% of Democrats will show up on election day. Now, that has been how it's been, at least in the last two elections. And again, we're not really using polling, but there is some indicators that GOP is showing up earlier this year than they have in the past two elections where Trump was their candidate. But we don't know that for certain until we see all the numbers get tabulated. Well, a couple other things. We've also noted that women are outnumbering men by record numbers. I believe it was 54 to 48% women versus men in 2020. And now it's in the neighborhood 55 to 56% women versus around 40 to 45% men. And then the other things we're looking at, of course, abortion and immigration and some of the shifting, supposedly, based on polling, of African Americans and Hispanics moving more over to Trump. Harris still holds an advantage, or Democrats still hold an advantage, but not as great as they did prior. And also some of the white votes, particularly among older women, that seem to be shifting toward Democrats compared to previous elections. So bearing all that in mind, most likely that will possibly wash it out. The numbers will wash, the changes will wash each other out, or one group will show up more heavily than the other group. For example, if more Hispanics and African Americans show up in greater numbers, leaning more into Trump than they did in 2020, we likely will expect then, compared to older women or white Americans showing up to vote, compared to 2020, we'll expect Trump to win. On the other hand, if white Americans tend to favor Harris more heavily, and you've got a greater number of women showing up, and there's more of a shift in that direction than there is a shift of African American Hispanics moving toward Trump, then we would expect Harris to win this election. And then, of course, there's been a lot of controversy around some of the Hispanic population more recently, with some of the comments coming out of the Madison Square Garden rally, and also some of the concerns among Harris's history as a prosecutor among African Americans when she was in the state of California. And so that's where it stands. So let's go ahead and take a look at the states. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to black out every state except for the one we're going to be talking about at the present in order to not be distracted. So let's just go down each one of the states. Currently we have 226 in favor of Harris and 143 in favor of Trump. Starting at our first state, we are projecting 53.5% to go toward Trump and 46.5% to go to Harris. Now, this is before the mail-in ballots. With the mail-in ballots, I am expecting this to narrow down probably closer to around 2%, as opposed to that's a good 7%. I'm guessing anywhere from 2 to 3%. That would mean Democrats gained about 1% from 2020, but not enough to eclipse Trump's lead. So at this time, well, this is the final projection, we're expecting Trump to win the state of Texas, bring him to 183 compared to Harris's 226. So let's move on to Florida. Now, yesterday, in the 2 or 3 days prior, in the previous projections, we had Harris barely winning the state of Florida. But as more votes came in, that lead she had at one point was about 2% over Trump, narrowed and whittled down to 0.2% yesterday. So today, as of this morning, with the last batch of early votes, it does look like Trump is poised to get the state of Florida. And that's barely. Right at this point, we have him leading Harris 50.2% versus 49.8%. So that is quite a growth for Democrats. So they should be proud of that, but not enough, again, to take the state of Florida. So we're projecting that Florida will go to Donald Trump, 213 to 226. So you can see that those last batch of votes really made a difference. And of course, we're already getting some of the votes in right now being tallied in the state of Florida from the decision desk in the NBC Decision 2024. So looking at the state of Florida, and it is currently 7:37 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And in the state of Florida, we currently have a total of 3.9 million estimated votes remaining. 67% expected votes have already been placed in. And you can see 53.9% going to Trump and 45.2% going to Kamala Harris. Now that just jumped up a good 1%. So you can see there's already an 8% spread there. So if I were not counting the ballots, we talked about the mail-in ballots, you can see this is matching my projection. 46.5 to 53.5 versus what the decision address is showing, 45 versus 53.9. So pretty dang close, would you say? Now, let's go ahead and move on to our next state. And in this case, it's the state of Iowa. There's been some talk because of the Seltzer poll where Ann had Harris 3% over Donald Trump. And it did look like 3 or 4 days ago Harris was poised to take Iowa. But with the latest batch of votes, Trump has caught up and has passed Harris by a good almost 3%, 2.8%. So our projection is he'll get 51.4% Iowa versus 48.6%. Now, Democrats need not be sad because in 2020, Trump ended up winning Iowa by nearly 8%. So here we're projecting that he'll win by about 3%. So that's Democrats or Harris has shaved off 5%. But as it stands right now, with our final projection, we're expecting Iowa to go to Donald Trump. So it brings me to 219 to Harris's 226. So let's see if we have anything coming in for the state of Iowa. Probably not, as it is a bit early for Iowa. Okay, nothing in at this time. All right, so let's go on and move to our next state in the lineup, and that is the state of Georgia, a very contentious state. But it was the case that Trump had the lead for the past 6 or 7 days in the last 6 or 7 projections. Even yesterday, he had that lead. But the last batch of votes that just came in today, Harris went ahead. She's currently at 50.3% versus 49.7%. Well, that's what we're projecting, mainly because of the independent vote. In the state of Georgia, you can see here that 45% are Democrat, 48% GOP, and 7% independent. But it's not only the independent vote that's making the difference, but you can also see that in 2020, 92% of GOP voted for Trump, and 7% switched over to Donald Trump, and only 2% of Democrats switched over to Donald Trump. Or rather, 7% switched over to Biden. So superimposing that to Harris, we're going to expect her to barely take the state of Georgia by no more than about 30-something thousand votes. And that's last in 2020, it was around 11,000 votes. So a little bit of an increase, but not by much. But in our model, we're expecting her to barely take the state of Georgia. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if there were a switch up. So this is a very tentative state in my projection. But that brings her to 242 to 219, barely getting the state of Georgia. Although if Trump got that state, it wouldn't surprise me because it's that close. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next state in the lineup, and that's the state of Arizona. And here's another state where early on it looked like Trump was going to take that state, but at this time we got it 50-50, with a difference of only 3,000 votes in Arizona. It's that close. And I think it was something close to that in 2020. So we're seeing pretty much a similar outcome here, with Harris barely getting Arizona. And again, if Trump gets both Arizona and Georgia, that would not be as hard to imagine at all. These are literally within very small numbers, thousands of votes difference between them. It just so happened by the end of today, with the early voting, things were shifting toward Harris. And a lot may depend on what batch of votes came in. But at this time, we're projecting Harris takes Arizona, bringing her to 253 to 219. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to our next state in the lineup. And I'm going to go ahead and go down to Nevada. We're going to go ahead and skip North Carolina for the moment. And you can see here, she is expected to get North Carolina and Nevada. But I want to talk a little bit about North Carolina in a moment. But first, let's go to Nevada. And what's the difference here? The difference is that 6% independents there's a 6% lead among independents in the state of Nevada toward Harris, if we're using or superimposing 2020's behavior onto this election over Trump. And you can see in the Nevada, of all the voters, 34% were Dem, 38% were GOP, and a whopping 28% are independent. So that's a huge number. And they're coming out in droves, over 73%, nearly 73% early vote in Nevada. So that's quite tremendous. And also you can see that in terms of switching parties, that didn't happen much. 5% switched from GOP to Biden and 5% switch from Dem over to Trump in 2020. It really is that independent vote that is making a difference. So we're expecting her to get the state of Nevada. And that brings her up to 259 to Trump's 219. Let's go up back to North Carolina. And this is what I'm talking about. I really think the big story is going to be the independent vote that is leaning toward Harris more than toward Trump. And that is what is allowing her to win this election. You can see that even in the state of North Carolina, there's only a 4% spread between the independents going toward Harris, 50% versus 46% for Trump. But with that, in the North Carolina, 33% are Dem, 33% GOP, and 34% independent, meaning independent is the biggest block of voters. And because they lean into Harris, that's what's making the difference. Because, again, this is a tie between the number of Democrats versus GOP that came out to vote early. So this is quite tremendous. With her picking up North Carolina, again, it's close, so this is another state where Trump could win still, if enough GOP come out to vote. And we've already accounted for the fact that GOP is coming out more likely to vote than Dems on Election Day. So we've already counted for that. But even with that, we currently have Harris winning North Carolina 50.3 versus 49.7. That's only 0.6%. So again, these states are very razor thin in terms of her lead. So it's very, very possible Trump could take all these three states. And I'm just going to go through finishing off these three Midwestern states, and let's presuppose then after Trump does pick up those three states and see what happens. But with North Carolina, she does end up winning the 275 versus Trump 219, and she didn't even need the Midwest using this model. All right, let's go ahead and move on to those Midwestern states. The first among them is Wisconsin. And in the state of Wisconsin, Trump had been leading with quite a lead early on, anywhere from 6 to 7%. But now it's been whittled down to about 3.6%. But that's still a lead and an improvement over 2020. Why that's the case, even though there's a 12% independent vote spread, has a lot to do with that. Let's take a look here. In Wisconsin, 51% of Democrats have already showed up, where only 25% of GOP showed up. So we're expecting more GOP, 75% of GOP to show up, giving GOP a 2.7 multiplier compared to the Democrats' 0.95 multiplier. That is what's making that difference. Now, if those GOP don't show up and they've already cannibalized their votes by showing up early, or they're just not showing up, then Harris would win Wisconsin. But given that only 25% of GOP have showed up, and we're using the model of 2020 when they showed up in mass on Election Day, that's why we're expecting Wisconsin to go over to Donald Trump. Bring them 229 to Harris's 275. We're down to the last two states. Michigan, we're expecting Harris to barely win that state with 50.1 versus 49.9%. That's only 0.2%. Every one of these states are barely razor thin for Harris, except for Nevada, and even that's quite close. And again, the difference here being that it's even in terms of the number of votes that have showed up, 44 versus 44%. In terms of what showed up so far, 71% of Democrats versus 64% of GOP. So that spread is only 7%. But because independents are leaning heavily toward Harris, that is what gives her that razor-thin edge, giving her the state of Michigan. All right, and so we're finally down to what's considered to be the most contentious state of all, and that's Pennsylvania. We do have her comfortably winning that state with 1.2%. That's much better than the showing in 2020, where I think it was even less than 1%. But again, this comes down to that in the state of Pennsylvania, 33% of only Democrats showed up, whereas 19% of GOP showed up. So we're expecting more voters to show up in Pennsylvania with that strong ground game in Pennsylvania with Harris and strong ground game from Trump in Pennsylvania. Both of them doing a strong ground game, and ground games usually have it on election day, and they typically do lean into voting on election day as well. And I think there's some kind of rule in Pennsylvania where people do tend to come out on election day. But the spread is not that great. It's 14%. And independents is 36% showing up, 36%. But in terms of the overall vote, it's 11% total. But also, the Dems have a lead, 56 over 33 in early voting, plus the mail-in ballot. That's why I'm expecting at this time Pennsylvania to go over to Harris. So if we were to use this particular model, we see 309 for Harris to Trump's 229, making her the first female president of the United States of America using this model. Now, I'm going to do a exercise in speculating. Let's speculate that these razor-thin states go to Trump. Let's say Georgia actually goes to Trump, and North Carolina goes to Trump, and Arizona goes to Trump. If that's the case, he'll win 272 to 266. That's very, very close, even with those three states. But he would have to take all of those three states. And that's probably not likely. Even if he took 2 out of 3, let's say that he was unable to take Arizona, which is the least amount of electoral votes, then Harris still wins, 277 to 261. But as it stands right now, I'm projecting, using our model, that Harris will end up winning the 2024 U.S. presidential election with 309 versus Trump's 229. And I'm being extremely conservative, presuming that a heavy number of GOP will come out to vote. I'm also discounting that 32 million mail-in ballots into the count, and I'm presuming that she does no better than Biden among independents. And a lot of polling suggests she's actually going to do better among independents than did Biden, and also suggesting that she has a larger lead or spread between the gender, meaning more women and less men for Trump. So even discounting all of that, right now it looks like she's poised to win the U.S. presidential election 2024. All right, so we'll see how accurate this model is. And again, I try to remain neutral as possible, and even trying not to be swayed one way or the other, not using it in polling. And if it doesn't work, then we know that this model doesn't work, and we'll just move on to a different model for our next election. If it does work, then that's great, and we can continue to use this model. Feel free to let me know what you think if there's still time. Let me know who you think is going to win and what the Electoral College vote will look like between Harris and Trump. And give me some, comment as to why you think one candidate will win versus the other. And also comment if you like this model, and if you want to continue with the channel. There will be more things coming for Self-Society that I will be revealing over the course of the next couple weeks once the election is cleared up. So feel free to subscribe and give it a thumbs up and hit that bell for future notifications. Good day.